Week ago, if you wrote it down, remember that I asked you to read through the book of Revelation and find anything that you found repeated. Now, when I did that, I came up with a list of about 40 things that are repeated. But if you would, let's just take a minute and share anything or phrases or words that you've seen repeated in the text. 7. Okay, very good. Thank you.
References to time, like shortly take place or soon.
Time, things that'll take place soon or the time is near. Yep, Moya. To the angel of the church. Okay. Okay, take Andre first, then Dan.
To the one who is victorious.
To the one who is victorious. Okay. Seals and woes. Conquers. I am so happy to not be up there right now. And this is great. You can move.
The first and the last.
First and the last. Okay. Authority. Okay. Anyone notice blood of the Lamb? Repeated. So do some more of that, because what I really want us to do, Sunday we're going to start with Revelation chapter 1. It's not going to be me sitting up here lecturing and telling you what it means. We're going to study Revelation just like we would any other text. I want you to become very familiar with it. What it means, well, as I showed Sunday, we saw 2 different interpretations. And those 2 men who worked on those interpretations worked on it very, very hard. We're going to look at it, or 4 men. Tonight we're going to look at 4 other men, 2 who I think are dreaming, and 2 who I believe have held a position that was very similar. But Revelation chapter 1, we will study it similar to how Austin took us through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, because I really want us to know what's in the text. Okay? All right. We looked at Sunday the historical background and the historical preterist. Does anyone remember how those 2 different interpretations might have a common name for them? What they're commonly called. Let's say the historical background. I told you Sunday.
The preterist would be 80-70.
Okay, the preterist is 80-70. What about the historical background? Late date, right? So I would say the way most of us talk about it, I would say the historical background is late date, focused on the Roman Empire. The historical preterist is the early date, focused on the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? So if you can remember those 2 things, you probably remember enough of just as what that viewpoint is. All right, tonight we're going to start with a continuous historical. So how many have heard of the continuous historical? You probably haven't heard it with that term, but I know that when I was growing up, I heard a lot about Revelation talking about the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. How many heard that? I was going to say, I would not be surprised if that's a bit of a generational thing. And part of the reason I say that is it was made pretty popular in the churches of Christ because John T. Hines wrote the commentary on Revelation for the Gospel Advocate commentary. And, I think anybody in my age group and older knows that that was pretty much the prevalent commentary set, if anybody had one at all. in their house that had the New Testament commentary from the Gospel Advocate. Okay. So what is this? Well, it outlines the major events through history, culminating in a general apostasy from the truth. So if you go through it and look at it, symbol by symbol, what it tries to do is walk you from the first century all the way up into the Reformation period. Some, like John T. Hines, who have a Church of Christ background, take it right into the Restoration movement. So they interpret some of the symbols to be a prediction, especially Albert Barnes did, of the Reformation. Now, why do you think that someone would look at Revelation and think of the Catholic Church and the Reformation? It's Wednesday night. All just had dinner, we got in from work, so we're all really sleepy.
Because the Pope fits some of the descriptions.
Because the Pope fits some of the descriptions. I would also say, well, think about this. Who was the natural follow-on to the Roman Empire? The Roman Catholic Church. Why do you say that?
But when the empire broke down, the church had a hierarchy in place. You even look into more modern history, but definitely during the Renaissance, it ruled a vast swath of Europe, either outright or through their influence on monarchies.
Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church for a long, ever heard of the Holy Roman Empire? Who was dominating the kings of the Holy Roman Empire? The papacy. Do you know where the College of Cardinals, the hierarchical structure, came from in the Roman Catholic Church? It's pretty much a follow-on to the structure, the bureaucratic structure that existed in the Roman Empire. The Pope sits where the emperor sat. Cardinals and the archbishops and all that, they just like they had provinces and there were governors over provinces, you've got the same kind of setup in the Roman Catholic Church. So the reason they point at the Reformation is because to somebody who is looking at it, when the Catholic Church goes into is considered to be the apostate church, and then the Reformation comes along and it's viewed as they are returning things back or trying to reform it back to more what the church was without a pope. If you're in the Reformation, who do you think is the head of the church? Well, just say from our standpoint, who do we see as the head of the church? Jesus. We don't see any man as being the head of the church. So, the virtue of this, if there is a virtue for this view, it's that it gives a synopsis of church history since the days of Christ. And its interpretation really kind of lines up with Acts 20, 29 through 30, and 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3. Somebody want to read 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3 for us?
And the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, breathing sincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. Is that through 5?
Yeah, that's correct. Through 5.
For it is made holy by the word of God forever.
Yeah, so what are some things in that list that if you're a Martin Luther and you're looking at that list, what are some things in there that you would say, that's something the Roman Catholic Church teaches?
Abstain from meats.
Abstain from meats. Celibacy. And so they look at that and they see, well, this is, Revelation predicts that this great falling away is going to happen. There's going to be this power of the beast. They attribute that to being the Pope. Some have used the number 666 to say that that is the number of the Pope, you know. And so we won't get into all of that, but but they do see basically this is in symbols that interpret the Reformation age, and that the true church is seen as glorified and restored at the end. Okay? So what's some problems with that viewpoint? Well, I think the biggest problem with it is it's inconsistent with the time element. What does Revelation say about the things it's writing about? When's it going to happen?
Soon to come to pass.
Soon going to come to pass, or shortly. And even though it uses passages like Acts 20 and 1 Timothy 3, is this Revelation really talking about the same thing? That's a big question, right? I don't think so, but but remember that when we said there are rules for interpreting figurative language, one of the rules was it should agree with the general and special scope, right? So if I go quote 1 Timothy 4 or Acts 20, does that fit with the scope of what's being discussed in Revelation? Well, obviously these guys think so, but it doesn't appear so to me, and here's some reasons why. It's not consistent with the time element. Revelation says these things must soon take place and that the time is near. So how could one take 1900 years of history and describe that as things that must soon take place? Problems. And ask yourself this: what first century person saw anything going on that indicated that the Catholic Church would rise? Nothing. I mean,
But the apostasy was predicted, and they said it had already started.
yes, but was there any head of the church on earth? No. And how closely did the church at that point? Those are the kinds of questions I think you would have to ask yourself. Was there anything that they would have seen that would have indicated it? And not only that, this theory, I didn't mention this, but they spend a lot of time talking about Mohammedanism and the decline of Mohammedism in their prediction. Okay, so they see it rise, but they see it at the time it was written going down. We'll say more about that in a minute. The other thing that I think is a problem for them is they have a lot of subjective application. In other words, there's 50 different systems of interpretation based on this one view, that is the Roman Catholic Church. And what ends up happening is that you get inconsistency. You can't get two people who agree on what the symbols mean. So, for example, determining the meaning of the visions of the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls of wrath could obviously fit more than one historical event. Therefore, deciding which one is to apply is solely to the subject or to the subject of the person doing the interpretation. I think the other problem, and this is the big one, so when Albert Barnes wrote it, was different than the time we live in. And when John T. Hines published it, which I think was 1937, his view of the world doesn't fit the world that we're in now. Some of the predictions they made didn't come to pass. So, for example, they describe the sixth plague is referring to the Turkish Empire, which I think would have been the Ottoman Empire, from which rose Mohammedanism, commonly known as Islam. He acknowledges that both Eliot and Barnes defended this view and gave historical events to indicate that this religion began a gradual loss of power beginning in 1820, signified by the waters of the Euphrates drying up. Okay, now I'll ask you, looking at it from our point of view, is Islam declining or gaining strength? It's gaining strength. And so, to me, I see this as the major weakness in this method. As time marches on, what people thought it meant from their point in time will change. And this seems to confirm to me the need to limit the meaning of Revelation to things that will soon take place. See, I think what happens whenever you try to get in and try to be remember one of the things we talked about in understanding apocalyptic literature is, what is it meant to be taken and try to assign a meaning to every symbol, sign, and metaphor in it? So what happens when you do that? You end up with something like this where, well, Mohammedanism is on the decline, which shows that Revelation is true. Well, now what? What do you do with it that Islam is on the increase? Okay?
One problem too, logically, is that if that actually is what Revelation was saying, that means Revelation was wrong.
Yes. Right.
We've got to be careful. We know this is right, so we've got to go back and look at our interpretation.
Yeah. I think what I would say is probably the Revelation commentary in the Gospel Advocate set is probably the most neglected book in there. People don't look at it very much. So here's some examples of what they do when they interpret it. You have the letters to the 7 churches. It's very similar to the first 2 we looked at. They treat those letters as literal. They agree with the idea that the actual apocryphal Revelation begins in chapter 4. But if you start looking at it, you start to begin to see some differences when you see like the first seal on the white horse. Hines says it's the Roman emperor's period of military triumph from 96 to 180. But basically that Albert Barnes takes the emperors from Domitian to Commodus, which was, I think, I never can remember. These are the Flavian emperors, I believe. And so they see it, they both see it as Roman emperors, but then they've got it assigned different times. The 144,000, or Hines says they're saints on earth between the 6th and 7th seal, and Albert Barnes says it's the church on earth preserved from extinction. The great harlot, they see it as, Hines says it's the apostate Roman church, and Albert Barnes, it's the papacy. And the true church, New Jerusalem, is the true church glorified, but Barnes thinks it's the future blessedness of the righteous. Not a huge difference, but compared to what we saw with those interpretations that see it as the fall of Rome or the fall of Jerusalem, those first 2 more fit the time frame, right? That it's within a short time or the time is near, whereas this is extended out. So, do you have any questions about this? I do. All right, that's as much as we're going to say about that. All right, the Futurist Interpretation. I would say most of your friends in the denominational world believe this one. And there's a whole industry around it. Books are written on it, just amazing amount of books. It basically, it says it's fulfilled in 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. And it does something that I don't think any of the first three do, which is to try to interpret Revelation literally. Okay? And that completely violates the whole thing we've said in the first two classes. It does not recognize the difference between figurative and literal language. And one thing I will tell you is that when you start looking at it, they pick figurative when they want figurative, and they pick literal when they want literal. Okay? So, I'm not going to say a lot about premillennialism tonight. I will go over it very basically. But Shane has volunteered. Since I did the lessons on marriage, he'll do the lessons on premillennialism. That seems fair. All right. But, so, as I said, it attempts to interpret Scripture literally. Now, ordinarily, when we study the Bible, we should try to take it literal until the text or the context shows that it isn't. Okay? And if the literal meaning of any word or phrase makes good sense in its context, then it ought to be accepted as literal until there is a good reason to regard it otherwise. We've talked about Jesus' use of hyperbole. We've talked about his use of similes and metaphors and parables. How do we know we're dealing with a hyperbole? We know it by the context of what's being said, right? And so this particular way of looking at Revelation just fails to recognize the literary genre of apocalypse. So apocalyptic literature is, as we've already said, is not really designed to be taken literally. It is figurative, and the original readers knew this. Now, this is one of those things too where if I look at this and give people the benefit of the doubt, how long before I knew, or how long ago did I learn that there were other apocryphal books written in the intertestamental period and in the first century, and it was a type of literature that was generally available that we don't have. So how would people look at this? Well, they would say, what is this? What is Revelation? It seems so different. And so you try to go in there and you start trying to figure it out. And there are some things that I think people are like, they didn't see it as fulfilled in the first century. They're trying to figure out, is it presenting something that's going to be fulfilled in the future? And let's go to work on figuring out what the future is going to look like. Does that make sense? I think that's what happened here. So, now, the one thing we need to remember, though, if you're familiar with the text, and this is why I want us to know it, what happens whenever John has a question about what he's seeing? Someone explains it to him, right? What happened when Daniel was sitting there wondering, what in the world is this vision that I just had? And it terrified him. And Michael the archangel sent to him and says, you are greatly beloved, and I've been sent here to give you an explanation of what you saw. That's very typical with apocryphal literature. So, because things are explained, we're not left to wonder what the great red dragon means. Because John was told that the great red dragon is the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. So we don't need to go out and try to come up with other explanations for it. Okay? Shane, I'm indebted to him. He found this in something he was reading, but I think this just completely states what the problem is. One cannot help but notice the continuation of end-time speculation, both Christian and non-Christian. You know, I used to think that the History Channel was the Hitler Channel. Then it became this, we're going to go look at all these ancient prophecies and start predicting what's going to happen. And even on the History Channel, they're digging into Revelation and trying to explain the numbers and what's going to happen in the future. So it's not just a industry for premillennialism, but it's just, goes on all the time. And a perusal of any of the informative books that trace the history of the interpretation of Revelation shows that the contemporary church is yet to learn many of the important lessons on church history on this issue. This could fit the last interpretation I talked to you about. In every instance, and there have been so many, in every instance over the past 2,000 years, when someone has predicted or sensed the end was near, they have been demonstrably wrong and their prophecies patently false. Now, we got a chuckle out of this last part. Lamentably, even though this apocalyptic airplane has crashed every single time it has attempted to take off, there still seems to be no difficulty in finding passengers for promised future flights. This will continue as long as dogma continues to be a masquerade of exegesis. I mean, wasn't it, I'm trying to remember how many years ago, was the guy that said it was that the world was going to end in January. And the date came and nothing happened. Now I remember I did not go to bed nervous that night. I really didn't think it was going to happen. But that just seems to continue to happen whenever you give a futurist view to something like Revelation. Well, what are some of the issues with it? Well, it's definitely inconsistent with a time element. This interpretation claims that the major message of Revelation is yet to be fulfilled, making the time statements absolutely meaningless to the people it was written to. And that first century Christians needed to know and understand, or why first century Christians would need to know and understand what was happening, or they needed to know what was happening to them, but why they would need to know about a future nuclear war would be of no comfort to the person who is about to be killed in the arena for their faith. All right? I don't think they were worried about nuclear war that day. And then you have an inconsistent interpretation of the figures. Now, and I'm trying not to be sarcastic here, but they tend to switch them as they need to switch it between literal and figurative. So some of you older folks that read Hal Lindsey, which his book went immediately out of date in 1989 because he predicted the reestablishment or the 1,000-year reign was going to happen or start around 1988. Because he had it figured out. He had done all the math, gone through everything, and added up 40 years from the establishment of Israel as a nation state, and that would be when everything would start to be fulfilled. But he did things like, and I remember reading this because I thought, wow, if he's right, he could describe nuclear explosions, a colossal hydrogen bomb. He equated the locust with the breastplates as being Cobra helicopters spraying a kind of nerve gas. He talked about the earth being polluted by radioactivity. And this one, which I don't remember, but I'm sure Coca-Cola would have been happy about, that there would be, when all this distress came, there would be a big run on Coca-Cola. So the other man who has written on it, and I would actually say is probably more serious-minded than Hal Lindsey, at least he wasn't didn't try to sensationalize it. He is inconsistent because he tends to switch back and forth between interpreting literally and figuratively. To him, the seven churches of Asia are not literal, but symbolic of the various stages of the church from the first century to the present time. So what he thinks is that each church just describes a different phase of the apostasy. until we all end up like Laodicea, lukewarm and not really very fervent for the faith. Okay. And then when he describes the sixth trumpet, which is portrayed as an army of 200 million men, he doesn't take the seven churches literally, but the 200 million men he insists and assures us is literal. He switches to figurative when interpreting the heads of the horses, which are compared to heads of lions out of whose mouth fire, smoke, and brimstone issue. He says, this again is a description that might be comparable to modern mechanical warfare. So, this is also significant. Futurists want to make numbers literal, especially the 1,000-year reign of Christ. They insist the numbers are literal, except when you get to Revelation 13:18. They consistently interpret the number 666 to be symbolical, even though they apply the symbols to whatever currently seems fascinating. So, what we should remember is that Revelation is written in an apocalyptic language, symbolic, figurative style. And what it was meant to do was the signs and symbols were designed to reveal secrets in an unforgettable way. So we're not supposed to spend a bunch of time trying to say, well, the locust or attack helicopters. Okay. Questions about that?
I think that overall concept of any time we look at a book that's hard to understand, just the idea that it has to mean something to the audience. Like 98% of the issues with this or with books like Song of Solomon come from interpreting it like it was supposed to mean absolutely nothing to the people that originally wrote it and only mean something to us. And it's just silly.
And I think it's a conceit on our part, to me, I think, because we don't think those people were capable. And they couldn't understand, Wes?
C.S. Lewis called this chronological snobbery. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Everything's about our time.
Yeah, and I think that we have to be careful because sometimes we will discredit ancient sources, acting like, well, they were ignorant and they obviously couldn't spot something that was going on, right?
What's the danger behind that is that you can actually miss the message for yourself. Because the way the scripture works is once you fully understand what it meant for them, then now you're in a position to critique yourself. And if you automatically jump to yourself, you're going to miss the entire point of the book.
Yes. Is Corinth, since you spent so much time on it, it was written to the Corinthians, and they had a specific set of problems. Sometimes I think what we do with it is we start trying to second guess the text. Why in one place does it state something in a positive direction and say do this, and over here it states it in a negative to a different group? Because this group over here may be doing the right thing and needs encouragement. This group over here, they're not doing the right thing and it's got to be corrected, right? That's why you don't have everything all together. How do we arrive at truth? We go look at all of it, and then we understand the whole picture. So premillennialism. So what these guys would say is that we are in a period before the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, this is where premillennialism goes completely off the rails, I think. They go based on the theory that Christ failed to establish the kingdom promised in Daniel 2. And that the world wasn't ready to receive Jesus, so they killed him. And so Jesus' first turn at coming to earth was a complete failure. He didn't accomplish the purpose. Now, they say that there will be a rapture to take the true followers of Jesus home. Then a 7-year time period of tribulation will occur. Then Christ will return and reign on the earth for 1,000 years. establishing the kingdom of God forever. So that's what they're waiting for. If you read their literature, they're like, you know, you remember the bumper stickers? Some of us who are older, you know, be careful, this car might be unoccupied in the event of the rapture, right? And so the problem with it, premillennialism, it's inconsistent with Bible teaching. Why did Jesus die on the cross? He died as a sacrifice for sin, not because he failed and the people rejected him. In fact, Acts 2:23 says that God did that by his predetermined plan. That he had planned this all out. He knew they would do that. And then Jesus said in his prayer in John 17:4, I have accomplished the work that you gave me to do. So Jesus didn't think he failed, and he knew exactly what was going to happen because he kept saying it in the gospel. We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be persecuted. I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise on the third day. So to me, it seems like there's a dilemma for the premillennialist. Did Jesus accomplish what God desired? Well, they would say, no. Did Jesus have to postpone some things for which he would have to come back and complete? They would say, yes. What will prevent Jesus from failing again? I mean, that to me is a dilemma, right? The other thing that's interesting to me, and some of the people who advocate for premillennialism are Calvinists. And the central argument of Calvinism is that God is sovereign and that man cannot reject God. That seems strange right here, doesn't it? That, you know, well, Christ failed, but God is sovereign and God can't be resisted, but Jesus failed. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. That's very high level. Go for it, Shane. I'll let you take it from there. So this is kind of what you would see in a futurist type thing. You've got the outlines of the letters to the 7 churches outline the history of problems in the Christian church. They have the open door to heaven, where all the other interpretations say that's the beginning of the apocalypse. They say, well, that's the church in heaven. And to me, I don't get that, because that looks, to me, it's the throne room scene. Clearly, even from the Old Testament references. Hal Lindsey had that to be the open door to heaven was the rapture. The first seal on the horseman of the white, first sealed horseman on the white horse, the prince of Daniel 9:26, who heads up a revived Roman Empire and becomes world leader. Remember, this is always in the future with them. However, Hal Lindsey saw it as the European Antichrist. He thought the common market was going to be the Antichrist. The 144,000, Wolbert thought it was literal Israelites brought safely through the Great Tribulation. And these 144, Lindsay said the 144,000 Israelites are Jewish evangelists. The Great Harlot was the apostate world church of the future, which controls politically by ecclesiastical power, and the New Jerusalem is the dwelling place of all saints of all ages, here seen in future eternity. So, this is one where I'm not going to recommend a book for you to read. Don't go out and get this.
Was this the late great planet Earth?
Yes.
Did he believe that there were women that were among the 144,000?
I read that in 1986, so I don't remember. Yeah. I mean, the day that, when January 1st, 1989, he was sort of out of date at that point. So.
Do we have any idea what Hal Lindsey meant by black arts in the part about the great harlot?
Oh, yeah. Like witchcraft, things
Oh,
like that.
Okay, I see. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay, yes. That looks radically different than the first three, does it not? Yeah. So, I'm going to come back to this. We said how to understand Revelation. Let less be more. You hear what we meant by that?
Less interpretation of the symbols.
Yes. Look at the vision. Take what you're told it means. Move on. That's right. That's one way to do it. Keep the main thing the main thing. And those things where God is control. God is in control. This was encouragement to persevere or repent and then remain faithful during harsh times. And also that it proves that God is sovereign, so you better remain faithful. And then never forget the time frame. When is it supposed to happen? Soon. That, if you guys don't get anything out of this class other than that, when is Revelation, what does it talk about? Things that are near, 22:6, not 22:6, I think. Forgot. It's in 22. And the time is to be soon. Okay? The things that must take place soon. And then the reader must allow its truths to work in his or her life. I think this speaks to just what Austin and Shane were talking about. We read what it meant to the people who received it, and there are lessons in it that we are to take and apply to us. One of them is that he who overcomes shall inherit all things. But the cowardly and the faithless will be in the lake that burns with fire. I think that's a message for our time, right? That they were expected to testify for Jesus. And they did it, the text will say, because they did not love their lives even unto death. They knew what would happen, and they did it anyway. So, all right. That's enough here. I'm excited. We're going to go into Revelation now. So if I've confused you, I'm sorry. If I helped you, I'm happy. All right. Thank you.